Let's see. We got just a couple of minutes before we get it started, before I kick it over to all y'all. Anyone going anywhere fun for spring break?
I'm going to tropical Wisconsin.
Tropical Wisconsin. Nice. I was Jason Maysberg Tomlinson came to my class yesterday and he mentioned Wisconsin, and it wasn't the point he was trying to make at that point, but he was showing how the subtitles are not accurate. And I can't remember for the life of me what it had Wisconsin as, but it was not Wisconsin. It was like my cousin or something like that. It was fun.
Where in Wisconsin are you going?
Appleton. My sister-in-law had a baby in December, so we're gonna go hang out with her. So we're hanging out with the baby.
Cool. Congratulations. That is very cool.
Thanks. Yeah, looking forward to it.
So that'd be like 3-ish, 4-ish months. That's still kind of like amoeba stage, right?
Yeah. The planet pot stage where you just set them in their seat and they don't move. Yeah.
You know, my son is 10 years old, and I went to tuck him in last night and was greeted by a Nerf gun ambush. So there are advantages and disadvantages to their motility as they get older. So
yeah.
All right, well, we are about at time, so we'll get this thing started. Hi, everyone. I'm Don Saucier. I'm the Faculty Associate Director of the Teaching and Learning Center, and you've come to our professional development series. Whether you wanted to or not, you are here, and it's noon, and we're glad to have you. For those of you who can attend in real time, we have archive of these events and posted on the TLC website, the recording where you can enjoy this at your leisure asynchronously after the fact. We also have opportunities for people to earn both certificates as a GTA or as a faculty or staff member. And if you're a faculty member, also to potentially become a TLC fellow. And one of my TLC colleagues, Noah, has already dropped that into the chat, anticipating that I'd be asking for that. So thank you so much. So you can check out that link for what you need to do if you want to get a certificate or become a TLC fellow, which we would love you to do. The week after spring break, we have an event called Allyship and Anti-Racism that Cody Walls and her team are going to be putting on for us. So please check that out. It's awesome. And it's kind of an advertisement for something that'll be happening a little bit later in the fall semester, a training opportunity for people on campus. We also want to remind you that we do have a SOTL showcase. This will be the first annual SOTL showcase. And I think Hayden's going to drop something in the chat for us in a second, where at the end of the semester, the Monday of finals week, we're going to have basically a conference. So we're going to do it in the library. It's going to be awesome. And people are going to be able to show off the cool research that they do as it relates to teaching and learning. We have a submission process. We have a Qualtrics link to kind of fill out to let us know, do you want to do a talk or a poster? We want to abstract, those kinds of things. We think it's going to be first annual. Jason Bergtold is going to do kind of the keynote address as this year's current Kauffman Scholar, which we're very excited about. So please check that out, and we'll be announcing it from here on out. You'll see it in our newsletter. You'll hear me talk about it and those kind of things. So that's what we've got coming up. But for today, we are very excited to have Brian Lindshield and Colby Moorberg, who are going to talk to us about Rome not being built in a day and talk about open educational resources during what I think is Open Educational Resource Week.
Correct. Open Education Week. Thank you.
And Brian and Colby, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. So my name is Brian Lindshield. I'm a professor in the Department of Food, Nutrition, Dietetics, and Health.
And I'm Colby Moorberg, Associate Professor of Soil Science in the Department of Agronomy.
And so what we're going to focus on today is not our resources ourselves, but more the journey that has led to the resources and our pedagogy that we use around them is kind of what the focus of today is going to be. And if there's anything that you want to know, I'm dropping the link from for my Google Slides I'm using into the chat. I am signed in as my wife because somebody's using my Zoom downstairs to record, and I don't want to knock them off in case that doesn't work correctly. So I am Brian, not Erica, but I'm using Erica's Zoom. So this is the link to my resource, and we could talk about that if somebody wants to. But I wanted to kind of go back to kind of why I got to where I am, as far as wanting to create an open educational resource. And so as far as some of the background, my time as a student myself, I felt exploited by textbook prices. And so I always swore that if I was on the other side, I would do something different. And so these are some pictures of me, back, I did get my bachelor's degree from here at K-State. And so you can see some pictures of that as I was finishing in 2003. And so this is one picture they had us take. And then this is the Royal Purple yearbook. And so you see a picture of me there that I was doing there. So from there, I was interested in doing nutrition research and teaching. And so I went to the University of Illinois to pursue my PhD. And so one of the real influences I had there is I took a nutritional biochemistry course, and keep in mind, this is a little bit fuzzy, as I'm guessing it probably is for many of you too, who have been out of your degree for a while. I'm estimating about approximate time periods. I think it was about 2003 to 2004. I took a nutritional biochemistry course, and Manabu Nakamura, you see here, was the instructor for that course. And he had these beautiful handouts that we used instead of a textbook. And it was the first time I've kind of seen that. And so it was text that he typically wrote along with figures he oftentimes got from like peer-reviewed journal articles, but it was just really nicely done and formatted. It was really high quality product that we felt like we really learned from and really valued as students. And so that was something that I always had in mind about something that was really nice that he did that for us as students. Another influence was they had the college that the nutrition program in there is the College of ACES. So I think it's Agricultural Consumer Economic Sciences, I think is what, if I remember correctly. And so they had what they called a teaching college course. And so this was for graduate students and faculty members that were there. And one of the instructors, and they had like their best teachers or best instructors that helped kind of team teach this course. And so one of the team teaching instructors was Shelley Smith. And so I know she had some sort of beautiful online resource that she used for teaching her food science students that included terms that I think were defined. And I remember them showing it to us, and we were just kind of staring at it, you know what I mean? And one of the other faculty members that's teaching the course kind of picked up on what our response was. It said, please understand that, she didn't do this in a day. Rome wasn't built in a day. You know what I mean? And so I have here, to me, Rome seemed a long ways away, is what my kind of perception of what I saw that she'd done. I thought it was awesome, but I was like, I don't know how she ever got to that. You know what I mean? Is kind of what my viewpoint was at that period of time. So moving forward, another thing that kind of influenced me that has a K-State connection, which is kind of cool, is around that same time was when Michael Wesch put out The Machine is Using Us, video on YouTube, which you can see has almost 12 million views and things. And so it was something that was getting enough attention that was shared with me. And so I was very inspired by the technology and things, and this idea of what we could do now with Web 2.0 and some of the different ways we could try to educate in that way. And so that's something that I was inspired by there. So I came to K-State, as a faculty member. I was given a prep semester before I was going to teach the course, that my major course, in the spring of that semester, because that's when it's offered on campus. And so I did that. It's an intermediate nutrition course. And so when I looked at what was available to me, the previous instructor was one that the style was that he had about 6 PowerPoint slides, and that's what he talked about for a 50-minute class period. For me, that was a complete non-starter. And so it was pretty much a complete reboot. If I was going to teach this textbook, I needed to do something totally different on how I was going to do this. And so what I decided to do was, at that point in time, Michael Wesch was using Webpage Wiki, and he described he's having some good success with students on being able to have them collaborate on some sort of written resource in order to be able to replace the textbook for a course and have them kind of be engaged and interactive in that way and trying to discern their understanding. So I decided to do that for spring 2009, the first semester I taught. So I worked to be able to prepare, to be able to teach without that. And so there wasn't a textbook or reading material. Instead, they had this Webpage Wiki that you see here. And it didn't go as well as I would have liked, is how I would describe it. So the students felt like they wanted something written to be able to support what they're learning about in class, but they didn't like that the wiki was changing all the time. Even though I was reviewing it on a somewhat routine basis, they didn't know exactly when they reviewed it if somebody else had changed something right before that. And so they didn't necessarily like that aspect of it. So going forward, I was trying to think about, okay, now what do I transition to? Because I don't think that worked, and I don't think I want to do that again. And so what I decided to do was to create, at that point in time, I think I knew what an OER was, but to use Google Docs as a platform to create a resource that could be utilized by people to be able to learn about intermediate nutrition. And so Google Docs was something I went back and forth with an undergraduate who had taken the course and got some ideas from. And so it was a way that is a platform that I was comfortable with. It wasn't overly techy in things in order for me to be able to do. And so what I worked for doing for the next spring was in trying to make sure that I had good drafts of nearly all the sections done before the start of the semester. And then I was finalizing those and rolling those out while I was teaching that course. And so unfortunately for the last chapters, last sections, I didn't have good drafts of those done. And so I had to kind of work pretty hard towards the end of that semester in order to be able to complete those. That was a stress. I wouldn't recommend, that to people. If you can avoid that sort of option, that would be something that I would suggest. And so what I did then was by the fall 2010, I had the complete resource by revising and kind of getting it to where I could package it together rather than rolling it out as sections, documents within folders. That it kind of became this resource you see on the screen. This is what it looked like, is that I had this doc, Google Docs, that was available to students or anyone who was interested in it. And so they could go and learn from these resources. And so they were for the online course. So I did start teaching this online. And so that was utilized there. And then spring 2011 for the campus course. Then I have what I would kind of refer to as the tweaking phase. And so that's from about 2010 to about 2019, because I didn't make huge, massive changes during this period of time. I did treat it as a living document. I was making revisions based off of responses to students and their feedback and things. And so I don't really believe, or my vision for this is not have additions. And so I make corrections or improvements based off of feedback that I have from students or other people. And so that's something to do. So one of the things I was doing this phase though was some scholarship of teaching and learning. So it's interesting that, Don was kind of throwing that out to something they're getting ready to do, here as well during this period of time. And so one of the things that really kind of stuck with me from when we did this is that we did some student surveys and we asked them about this since it was new. And so this was kind of a new way to provide a written resource for students to use. And so this is one of the questions they're asked. Compared to my normal experience with normal textbooks and other courses, I use what I referred to the OER at that time as the Flexbook, because that's why you see that language. And so you see, we gave them a scale from anywhere from much less to much more. They responded back between the campus and online students that they use it somewhat more than normal. So what does somewhat more than normal translate to? I asked about how frequently did they use it to get a better sense on what that translated to. So you see that never was about 1%, less than once a month was at 4, the 1%, once a month was about 7.4% or 2.9%, once every 2 weeks, 27.7 to 6.7, once a week, 2 times a week, more than 3 times a week. So for me, what I really took away from this is that 40.5% of my campus students and 12.5% of my online students reported using it every 2 weeks or less. Every 2 weeks, as far as the structure of the course, is about when there's a quiz. And so to me, this suggests that these percentage of students are probably not reading the book. They're using the resource more as a reference while they're trying to complete their assessments as it goes along with the course. And I don't think that probably is most advantageous for their learning. And so that's something I always kind of thought about. And so I was trying to think of what sorts of things could be done to try to increase student engagement with the resource and hopefully improve their learning. And so what happened was in the fall 2019, I had a student that was actually taking the Principles of College Teaching course here at K-State. And at that point in time, I don't know what the structure is now, at that point in time, they had a project that they worked on as part of the course. And so she came to me and I told her, this is kind of what my observation was. And I kind of felt like, trying to have something that would increase engagement. I'd been visited or I'd seen some things about the capability of Top Hat textbook, that would allow embedded questions that would connect to a grade book and allow some sort of question features to be embedded into a resource. They did, while this wouldn't be OER, they would allow my students to freely be able to use the platform for me to be able to utilize it this way. And so I would have an OER version and I would have this version that my students would use specifically so I could have this enhanced sort of functionality. So what I did, as far as that goes, is we decided to move forward on that project. And so Top Hat harvested the resource into their platform. And then as we submitted questions, they would load those questions into the system. I was writing the questions. And so I wrote about a chapter a week, throughout a semester. And so about 380 questions total. And so I did that in their Word document. They looked like this. You see on the right side, this is a screenshot of what it looked like I was producing. I then gave to my MS student who would check these and let me know if there were mistakes or things that she thought that could be worded better or other ideas that she had. She would submit those to Top Hat. Top Hat would get them in. she would check to make sure they were correct on the platform, and then she would actually place them into the resource at the correct location where we wanted them to go, is what she was doing. And so we were rolling this out while we were going through this sort of process. So we did do some survey research based off of this. And so this is what I think is one of the most important ones as relates to kind of why we went into this whole process. Was we asked what percentage of time on the platform did you spend answering questions and reviewing answers. And so you see that they report more than 50% of their time was on the answering questions, reviewing answers here. And so to me, some people, this might be very discouraging because they're like, oh, I'd like them to be reading and watching the videos and doing all the other things and not spending as much time on the questions. But to me, this maybe indicates that they're spending almost twice as much time engaging with the material as they had before. We've done this. And so I felt like this was something that I was very happy, to be able to see as far as this, and hopefully help us to be able to support their learning better. So in spring 2019, so this is kind of midstream to what I was describing there, I got a notification from a repository. So there's a number of places where OER are located. And so I got a notation or a notification from them that my resource had been harvested into a platform called LibreText. And so I was not familiar with LibreText. And so I reached out, they said, if you're interested in learning more about it, reach out to us. And so I did. And so I felt like there's the vision of what they wanted to do with LibreText was consistent with what I wanted to do with my resource. And so we started to move forward with the idea of moving my resource with its functionality in the LibreText as they were developing that functionality at the same time, because LibreText is relatively new. And so this was something that was happening at that period of time. So about summer 2020 was the first time we started using the LibreText platform, and that was happening somewhat fast. Top Hat was not being as agreeable, any longer with not charging the students and things. And so it really needed to make that change at that point in time, because I had stretched as long as I could, with what they had promised, when I first moved it over, and they weren't going to honor that anymore. And so I needed to move another direction. So summer 2020, we did that. They were finalizing getting the questions set up in their new system that was being developed at that point in time. And so they got those put in there. They didn't have the gradebook structure at that point in time. And so they were formative until spring 21. So there was a couple semesters there I taught where they were formative. So the students they could complete them, but I didn't know if they were completing them. I didn't know how they were doing. I couldn't assign them for a minor number of points. And so that was a little bit limiting. It wasn't quite as good as I would have liked, but they've gotten that functionality up now. And so we have more of the summative piece that's been going for about a year now. And then I'm piloting that LTI to help bring the scores into Canvas, which is another sort of additional step that is going to be needed for many people to do something like what I've done. Another feature that I kind of learned about as I was doing this is that they also developed a dynamic glossary capability at that point in time. And so I thought this was something that would really help students. I primarily was thinking about that when I talk to my students in the class, they oftentimes have a hard time pronouncing the term, let alone knowing what the term means. And so I thought this would be something that would be really helpful to them. And so as I started to understand, and into 2020, they had this functionality available, I tried to inquire about how it worked. And so I could try to figure out how to best utilize that if that's something I wanted to do. So as I understood how it was set up, I started making a list of terms, that were chapter by chapter, kind of working somewhat week by week, like what I did with the questions. And so I go through the chapter, say, these are the terms that to me, it seems like should be defined. And then I'd work through trying to find either a openly licensed definition, or I would define the term, myself. And I worked through a set of, I think it's about 850, of these. And so this Excel document is how I did this. And so that's what the screenshot is here. So it's a Excel document that's made to a CSV file, and then they can upload that in, and it makes the dynamic glossary feature that's available in my resource. So then the last sort of branch that I want to talk about is experience that we all probably had if you've been at K-State for any period of time, was last spring I was getting ready to teach my campus course, but I had to teach it hybrid. And so I was in a massive classroom, but even though I was in a massive classroom, because of the pandemic regulations, we could only have approximately half the class come on any day. And so I had to be able to come up with a way to be able to engage students, knowing that in actuality, and this probably experience you guys, not even 50% of them were there, on the days and things. And so the majority were outside of class on Zoom. And so I was trying to think of ways to be able to engage them. And so what I went back to was kind of what I had done with the OER, or putting those questions in. And I started to write questions for each class period and try to think about trying to break up the class period into chunks of maybe 7 or 8 minutes, and then giving them a question to be able to engage them around so that I could get a sense on how well they understand the information, as well as just to make an engagement point to reset their attention. And so I went through and did this. And I rolled this out as I was writing them before each class during that semester. And so this is kind of what it looks like if you want to see, what a module looks like. So they have these class videos and questions that they answered. And so for the campus course, they answer those throughout, but I've also been able to roll this into my online course. And so I could take a video like you see here, and then these are the questions that kind of go along with it. And so I put the video into that Canvas quiz, and then I have the questions that go right below it. And so I can embed that in. And so you see that it says like, answer the first question, answer the second question. They can see the options, but they can't see the actual question they know they have to answer without actually watching the video. And so the idea is to try to make sure you're driving them towards that. And this has been something that's worked well for me. I have to say that having seen these two things in tandem now, especially with my online students, I'm not sure how many of them were doing the reading or watching the class videos before. You know what I mean? Given what I see as far as their behavior related to due dates, and things where they're doing it all on the due date and things. And my thinking is if their behavior is to do it on the due date, I'm not sure if there's no due date. You know what I mean? If they do actually do the things that I was kind of expecting them to do. So that's led me to this hierarchy that looks like this as far as my course assessments go. So I have the class questions and LibreText questions you see here, which are open book, mostly multiple choice, very low stakes assessment. I have some quizzes, which are a little bit higher, and then I have exams. And so the idea is the difficulty stakes that I'm building them up to that so they can demonstrate their understanding as they get to that higher level of the course assessment. So that leads me to my last slide. So, Rome wasn't built in a day, but they were laying bricks every hour. You don't have to build everything you want today, just lay the bricks, and that's how you build an empire. So now I'm going to toss it over to Colby to share his experience.
All right. So again, my name is Colby Moorberg. I'm in the Department of Agronomy. And actually, before I get started, I'm going to just copy this link into the chat. So it's a link tree link, but if you click on that, you can actually go directly to the two open textbooks I'm going to be talking about today. All right. So like Brian, when I was a student, I also felt exploited by textbook costs. And I remember one time in particular, I paid over $750 in, I think, around 2005 for textbooks. And I went to an inflation calculator, and I figured out that ends up being about $1,100 today. So $1,100 in one semester just for books. And it wasn't any particularly large semester. I think it was maybe 15 or 16 credits. And yeah, I just felt sort of taken advantage of at that point in time. And then I also knew that spending that much money wasn't going to result in much money for buyback when I actually went to sell the books back to the bookstore at the end of the semester. And on top of all that, I had some scholarships, but most of my undergraduate degree was funded by student loans. And so I knew that that all these textbooks that I was paying an arm and a leg for was also racking up interest on my student loans that I had to pay back someday, and I'm still paying it back today. So that was sort of the context for me on my sort of thoughts towards textbooks. Now, one thing I also want to mention is as I walk through my different projects, I did most of this as a tenure track professor, and I think Brian did too. And I like to mention that because I've heard a lot of stories about people being discouraged from trying to do open textbook creation or OER stuff while they're on tenure track. But I started in 2015 and I got tenure last year, and I've made this sort of one of the cornerstones of my academic program. So that's just kind of one piece of context. And one thing I've thought about from day one when I got to K-State was my job description said that I needed to develop a nationally recognized teaching and research program. And I had plenty of examples of how you could do that for research, like just publish a lot, get invited to do talks, things like that. So kind of like the traditional, sort of successful university researcher. But I didn't really know how I could become nationally recognized for teaching, because usually it's just kind of a local thing, and there's not really much recognition beyond that. And what I found is that my work with open textbooks has actually sort of helped me achieve that goal for my job description. So another piece of context for you. And then also one thing I think is important is, despite being on tenure track, I was always encouraged by fellow faculty and the department heads that I've had over the years to keep on doing my work for open textbooks, because they see the impact on the students. So I've been really encouraged that way. Now, Brian did a good job of showing some examples of people that influenced him in terms of open textbooks, or not necessarily open textbooks, but open resources over the years. I was thinking about that while he was presenting, and I don't really have any classes that I can remember that actually had an open textbook or anything that wasn't like a normal just commercial textbook. In some cases, I'd have classes where there wasn't a textbook, but you got like lecture notes. But even then, it wasn't anything that was particularly dynamic. The one exception is something I'll talk about here with my my first project. So what got me started? So I started at K-State in 2015, and my primary responsibility is teaching a large lecture introductory soil science class called Aground 305 Soils. And we typically have about 100 to 120 students enrolled in this course in any given semester. It's taught in the spring and the fall. It's a 4-credit class with 3 credits of lecture and 1 credit of lab. And when I started, the lab manual that was required for the students costed $165, which equates to $195 today. And so I thought that was crazy. It was actually more than the commercial textbook that was required for the lecture. So the lab manual cost more than the textbook. And so one thing that kind of stuck out in my mind is when I was a graduate student at North Carolina State, they had a lab manual that was developed in-house, and it was provided to students for free as a PDF where they could print it however they wanted to, or they could go buy a printed copy from the bookstore for about 16 bucks. And it was a project that was kind of mainly led by David Krause, who I TA'd for when I was a grad student. But it was a project of about 5 or 6 different faculty that all had contributed to it from, I think, since the 90s, basically. And so the version that I had was from the 2000s, really, that I could sort of use. And so once I realized that the required lab manual was that expensive, it was actually too late to change the requirement for the first semester. And so I went ahead with that required lab manual. And I apologized to the students and told them to try to get a free copy or a borrow copy or something somewhere, because $165 was crazy. But from that point on, I was trying to figure out how I could take this NC State version and adapt it for use at K-State. And so that led me to my first OER project. And along the way, I also heard about this, the Open Alternative Textbook Initiative through the libraries. And I applied for that and received a grant for $5,000 to adapt this lab manual for use at K-State. So that's what got me going. So initially, my main goal was to take this NC State version and adapt it for use at K-State. And so I wanted to revise some chapters. I removed a few chapters, I added some new chapters. I did some reformatting. And all this was done in Microsoft Word, just because that's how it had been done at NC State. And there was nothing too crazy. It was just a big Word document. The disadvantage of that was that we had a really large Word document. And those of you that have used Word, you realize that once you get over 100 pages, Word becomes really unstable. And so I would be working on edits, and Word was crashing all the time just because it was such a big document. But it was what I lived with, just because I didn't really know of any other option at the time. Now, another objective I had was I wanted to survey the students, and I had kind of 3 things I wanted to investigate. One was, what is the actual impact of textbook costs on them? I knew what it was for me as a student, but I wanted to hear from them what their actual thoughts were on the impacts on them. And I wanted to know what they liked or didn't like about the manual so I could make changes if I needed. And also, I was curious about the preferences of format, particularly if they wanted a hard copy versus digital. And if it was digital, what sort of format would they, or how would they actually be consuming it? So I started working on that in 2015, and eventually had it published officially in 2017. And so in the process, once I was done with all my changes, I sent it to a professional editor who went through and made sure everything was grammatically correct, and did all sorts of work on it. So I had lots of great changes from the editor. And then I also created a new cover for it, just to kind of separate it distinctly a little bit from the NC State version. And I spent probably too long trying to put this cover together, but I really enjoy the cover because I actually use it in class just to show just how diverse soils can be and how pretty they can be. So that was part of the publication process. And I also published it through New Prairie Press, which is K-State's digital press through the Center for Advancement of Digital Scholarship. And in the process, it received an ISBN number, and it was also indexed to make the document or the book more discoverable. And then I also created an instructor copy, mainly to help with myself and the graduate students that helped teach the course, just to be able to help deliver the content more effectively during class. So the lab manual has a lot of blanks where there's questions that are asked, or students need to draw a diagram or something. And so the instructor copy basically has all that kind of fill it out for them, or fill it out for the instructors. So along the way, I published a peer-reviewed journal article based on the survey from the students. And so the survey was conducted at the end of the semester in the fall of 2016, spring of 2017. And we had 213 students that replied to it. And the key findings were that the students did report that they had financial hardship due to textbook costs. And most of them saw that open textbooks were a viable solution to those high costs. And they also preferred digital copies over hard copies, which kind of surprised me. Also, 2/3 of the students had reported that they had went without purchasing a required textbook for at least one of their college courses. And of those students, nearly all of them thought that their grades suffered as a result. So it was clear that students were being negatively impacted financially and academically due to the cost of textbooks. And also, I was asking a series of questions about if they use a digital copy, what devices did they have available to them? And the majority of students had laptops. I also asked about e-readers and smartphones and other devices. But it seemed like traditional laptops were kind of the clear choice in terms of what was available and what the preferences were. So that was kind of interesting. So now in 2017, I'm kind of looking back at the project, and at that point I had 2 publications, 1 book and 1 peer-reviewed article. And at that point I was satisfied with the condition that the manual was in, and I was looking for the next kind of low-hanging fruit. And the other course that I teach is called Agron 635 Soil and Water Conservation. And so I turned my attention to that course because we had issues with the textbook that we already were using. So for some context for that course, it's taught each fall. It's mostly upper level undergrads, and as well as about 1/3 that are graduate students. And the previous text went for about $30 to $40 brand new. There were some more expensive options that had hardcovers. There were some cheaper options that were used paperbacks. They can get it as cheap as like 12 or 15 bucks. So it was relatively affordable as far as commercial textbooks go. The content was good, but it was getting pretty dated. So it was last published in 2004. And at the time, all 3 of the authors were emeritus professors. And so I expected that there probably wouldn't be a 5th edition coming out. At least I didn't really hear any plans for upcoming editions. And on top of all that, the quality of images in the book were really low. Like, it was printed in black and white, and you could barely make out what some of the images actually were. It was also really verbose, and all the chapters were about twice as long as they needed to be, it seemed like. And so just talking with the students, the experience was that they all pretty much bought a copy, but only a few actually read it. So most of them weren't reading it at all. So I wanted to fix that. And so I started looking into kind of reimagining how I'd actually use a book in the course. I looked at other books that were on the market. Most of them were either expensive, they were too advanced for the level of course that I was teaching, or they were out of print, or all those things. So there were options, but none of them really kind of fit the bill in terms of what I was looking for. I also knew that for this particular topic, there are lots of what I consider alternative readings. And so these would include extension publications and videos, government publications from federal agencies like the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. So you can see on the right side here, the top one is a K-State Extension publication on riparian buffers. And the bottom right one is an NRCS publication on the same topic. So there's lots of different resources like that on just about any topic that I want to teach about in the class. Now, one thing, particularly with the extension publications, is that most of them had traditional copyrights. And so I couldn't just take that content and copy and paste it over into an open textbook. That would violate copyright. And so what I could do, though, is actually provide links to the student or for the students to these resources so they could download them and read them on their own. So after a few discussions with the librarians here at K-State, I decided that the best approach would be to actually develop an annotated bibliography. And the goal was to basically make it set up so it would be organized just like a regular book with chapters and sections and so on. And we would link out to these resources, but also there'd be an annotation that would provide some context to the students. And in the process, I could actually use this to implement a flipped classroom style of teaching for this course. And one thing I thought about too is that these students are mostly upper level undergrads or grad students. So they're going to be in the professional world in the next year or two. And once they're out in the professional world, I wanted them to not just rely on the first result on a Google search. I wanted them to actually seek credible information that they could use to make decisions. And one of the things I was hoping is that by using extension publications and government resources, they would actually seek out those types of resources to find credible information when they're making decisions. So that was sort of a side objective with it. Now, at the same time, I attended this open education conference in Niagara Falls in 2018. And at this conference, I was exposed to this term called open pedagogy for the first time. And there's different definitions of it, but the way I sort of think about it is it is teaching in a way where students just aren't consumers of information. They are producers of information. So they become teachers in their own way. They can also create content and gather information and present that information. So there's lots of different ways to sort of use open pedagogy. And in all of them, the students are a lot more engaged. And so I really like that idea. I attended a whole bunch of sessions about open pedagogy at the conference. And at the conference, I also got a copy of the book on the right called A Guide to Making Open Textbooks with Students. And they actually had a hard copy of that at the conference, and I read it cover to cover on my flight home. And when I arrived back in Manhattan, I was gung-ho about using open pedagogy and developing open textbooks with the students in this course. And so that eventually led to my next open textbook called Soil and Water Conservation and Annotated Bibliography. And for that project, we had funding from the Open and Alternative Textbook Initiative again, as well as the Open Textbook Fee. And my process was I created an outline that was like a very detailed outline for the whole book. And I created a guide to authors because I knew I was going to have a lot of contributors to the book, and I wanted to have a consistent style and sort of voice for all the annotations and all the citations. And then I also used Zotero, which is an open source citation management software, because I knew I was going to have a lot of citations that I was going to have to deal with for this publication. I was also working with faculty and professionals that were not students of mine, but were at other institutions. And so we used Google Drive and Google Docs to kind of manage drafts of the book or of each chapter, and we used Slack for communication. And then once we'd have a chapter developed, I'd send it as a Word document to a technical editor, the same one that worked on the lab manual to fix all the grammatical issues and stuff. And eventually, we would take the finished Word document, and I would format it within Pressbooks and sort of build out the book using the Pressbooks platform. So Pressbooks is, as Brian talked about, LibreText, which is sort of a competitor, if you will. But Pressbooks, it was a spinoff of WordPress, which those of you that used to blog probably are familiar with WordPress. But the idea is that bloggers could take their blog posts and actually produce books that they could go in, they could go and develop actually as a book. And so they started doing that for bloggers, but they also realized that there was a need for this for textbooks, and particularly with open textbooks. And so with Pressbooks, once you've built it out in Pressbooks, you can then have a web book version of the textbook. You can also export it in different ebook formats like EPUB and Mobi. And you can also export it as PDFs that are optimized for print or digital consumption. And so that's what we did. We developed this book and did it in Pressbooks, and we published it to New Prayer Press, so it got an ISBN and it was indexed and so on. And one thing I really liked about this project was being able to work with students. And so I published a case study on how we developed this annotated bibliography. In particular, there's an emphasis on the students in this case study. But in general, what I did is I made assignments where the students would choose from a list of topics, a particular topic that they were going to study or they were going to research. And they had to go out and find resources, given some guidelines that I gave them. And they had to find those resources that were preferably free and not behind a paywall. And then they had to properly cite those resources, write an annotation for them, and then do that sort of using a checklist of types of information sources I was looking for. And then they could, then they would present that to the class as a verbal or oral presentation. And it works great. What I did from that point is I would ask them if they want to include it in the open textbook. And so the process that we use is the students were credited as co-authors on the chapters that included their content. And we had the students sign memorandums of understanding. Anyway, I made sure they were familiar with what I was using for licenses for the book and how they'd be attributed as authors. One of the interesting things was students were really shy about having their particular content be attributed to them as an author, because I think they were worried that their writing quality wasn't kind of up to snuff with everyone else. And so what we decided was the process was they would submit their annotated bibliography. I would grade it just like any other assignment. But at that point, I would take their annotated bibliography and I would go through and double check all the citations to make sure they were correct. And I would also go through and actually edit all the annotations so that there was a consistent voice across all the annotations in the whole book. And then from there, the technical editor would go through and fix all the stuff that I didn't catch. And so in the end, everything was high quality. And then the students didn't have attribution at the topic level, but instead at the chapter level. And the students really appreciated that approach. It did require quite a bit of editing to make sure that this was actually there was actually good quality though. So there's pluses and minuses with having students be contributors that way. All right, so through New Prayer Press, this is what the back end looks like for usage data. And for this annotated bibliography, since it was published in December of 2019, we've had 1,200 downloads. And it's also been picked up by 6 instructors that I know of around the country that have now adopted this as a primary textbook for similar courses. So it's being used by quite a few people. So I'm really enjoying seeing that come around. But after this project was done, I went to do some more reflection. And at this point, I had published 2 open textbooks. I had 2 journal articles related to open textbooks, and I started thinking about what's next. I had this research question related to the annotated bibliography. And the question was, does regularly reading extension and government publications influence student perceptions of source credibility? So I was really curious to see if they would actually change their perceived credibility of these types of sources. And so I'm actually working on that question at the moment. I got funding from the Association of Public Land-Grant Universities to investigate that. So all the instructors that I know of that have adapted the book for their classroom, we're doing a surveys of the students before and after the semester to figure out if there's any change in the perceived credibility. So Another thing that really stuck out to me from this project was I really enjoyed the experience of using Pressbooks and the functionality of it. And that brought me back to the lab manual. And so I wanted to make a version 2 of the manual that actually uses Pressbooks. My most recent project has been working on version 2. And the picture on the right, you can actually see what the webbook version of the manual looks like. And you can see there's a drop-down menu on the left side, so it's easy to navigate between chapters and different parts of the book. And then within each of the manuals, or each of the laboratories, you can see the learning objectives are in green, all the materials needed for the lab are in orange, recommended reading in purple, pre-lab assignments that are like suggested problems in the sort of light green color. So I really liked that sort of consistency in the style of the manual. And so that's what I was kind of going for with switching the manual from Word into Pressbooks. I also liked that it was more accessible. So it made it easier to use with screen readers and students that have dyslexia and needed different fonts. They had a bunch of different options in terms of digital formats they could use where they could actually figure out the best font and style that made it easier for them to read. Another thing that I did was with the recommended reading, I previously used recommended readings that were from a commercial textbook, but I had since dropped the use of a commercial textbook in the course altogether based on this annotated bibliography idea. And now I just use free alternative readings online. And so I swapped all those out for free online resources. I also hired an undergrad using the open textbook fee. And she helped me format the LaTeX equations so they could display well within the manual. And also all the tables had to be formatted within a plugin called TablePress. And so now we have all these really nice looking tables that are used throughout the manual. I also did some changes in content. So we added one new chapter and I overhauled a few others. And we eventually published version 2 in February of last year. And also last year, like I mentioned before, I got tenure. So just use myself as an example that you can do open textbook projects and still get tenure. And then this February of this year, I created an instructor copy using version 2.0 in Pressbooks, and that was published in February. And also, I had several students that were wanting a print-on-demand copy where they could just order a copy and have it shipped to them, as opposed to taking the PDF and going to some print shop in town and getting it printed or using their own printer. And so I made that available starting in February. So lots of sort of new iterations on version 2.0. So this table shows, or these figures show the usage. So version 1 is in the top left. We've had over 8,000 downloads of version 1. Version 2, we've had 785. So we're getting really good downloads, and this is just for people that download the PDFs. We don't actually capture the downloads or the page views from Pressbooks. So this is just the PDF downloads. And then I also make the ancillary materials available to instructors if they fill out a Google form. And so what you see on the top right here is a cumulative requests for access of the Google form, so they can actually access these ancillary materials. And you can see that over time. So initially there was a big jump in requests, and it's been pretty consistent for the last few years. And then as soon as there was an instructor copy of version 2, there was another big jump in requests for access. So one thing to take away from this is this means that there's about 180 different instructors that have all requested access to the manual, and I assume are using the manual in part, if not in full, for their own soils courses. So I'm really pleased with the adoption of the manual. So trying to wrap things up here, at the end of this project, so this, like right now, I'm sort of in this kind of post-project reflection. And for the manual, I don't really have anything planned. I think I'm pretty satisfied with where it is at the moment. For the bibliography, I will continue to add new content based on this open pedagogy annotated bibliography assignment I do with the course. So I will continue to have new additions for new topics to kind of build out the content for that book. And I'm still working on this APLU credibility survey. I have some ongoing projects. So I want to make an annotated bibliography for my intro SOLAS class. So that's kind of one ongoing project that's about 2/3 of the way done. And I'm also creating an online version of my soil and water conservation class, which is necessitating a lab manual for the same class too. So I'm making a new open lab manual that will be used both for the online version and the in-class version. So I have some ongoing projects, some future projects I have. One thing I'm really excited about is the Canadian soil scientists came up with the Intro SOLAS textbook in Pressbooks. That's an openly licensed textbook. And what I like about that is that means I can actually take that book and adapt it for use in an American audience. And I'm in the planning stages with soil scientists around the US to try to figure out how we're going to tackle this adaptation of the Canadian textbook for use in the US. So that's in the works. I'm also really looking forward to integration of Pressbooks within Canvas. So K-State just got a new license with Pressbooks so that we can integrate Pressbooks and Canvas together. So just to make that a little more seamless for the students. And at some point, I'll probably make an online version of my SOLAS class as well. So my last slide here, I think it's important to think about sustainability for projects. For me, I'm interested in all these different projects, and sometimes I kind of get myself in a little bit deep. But I know that at some point, I need to stop making new content and just maintain the stuff that I have. And so there needs to be a balance between the projects. And so my long-term vision is I want to have all these projects completed. And so the Intro SOLAS textbook, I mentioned that's in the planning stages. The lab manual, I think that's done, at least for the foreseeable future. I'm in progress with this, with my second annotated bibliography. I'm done with my first annotated bibliography. And I'm in progress with the soil and water conservation manual. And I'm also working on creating new video content. So at some point, all this stuff will be completed, and then it just becomes a sort of maintenance topic. Some other things to think about is accessibility, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion. I know soil science has a long ways to go in terms of diversifying the soil scientists that are in the discipline. And I think with textbooks, one of the things that I can do is make sure that anytime there's a picture of people doing soil science activities in a textbook, I can make sure that the students that are in my class can actually see themselves doing the things, becoming a soil scientist. So that's something I keep in mind. I'm also always looking at soil research I could potentially do and how to keep students engaged. So that kind of wraps up my stuff. Some takeaways. Let students' needs kind of drive the conversation. Think about low-hanging fruit and impact when you're working on tenure, and take time to reflect and think about long-term sustainability. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and we'll have questions. I think it went a little bit long there, but we've still got time for questions.
Approaches. What you're all doing is so impressive and amazing and productive. It could be intimidating to kind of know how to start. So I'm kind of wondering, what's the baby steps approach to this rather than the peer reviewed and the third textbook and all that. What's the first thing to start?
I think it's the Colby's point of what's kind of the low hanging fruit. You know what I mean, is what I would kind of say. And we're at a point with open educational resources that in many cases, hopefully you won't have to start completely from scratch. And so try to understand what is available, to be utilized and possibly build off of that. Like Colby's saying he's doing with that Canadian book. He's like, hey, somebody published a book, you know what I mean? This is fantastic. Now there's something that I can utilize. And so I'd say that's kind of the approach. And then I always tell people that you've got to be able to chunk out a project and then be able to get satisfaction with completing the chunks. You know what I mean? I guess some things like, I told you I was doing a lot of things by week, and I get satisfaction by completing my weeks, and I follow through on completing my weeks with the vision of, if I complete my weeks, I will get to this big, massive thing being done. I guess some things is kind of how I would describe it.
And I think in academia, I mean, the example that I kind of come back to is when it comes to theses or dissertations, a done dissertation is better than a perfect dissertation, right? So it's just a matter of just getting something to a point where it's acceptable and functional. And then from that point, there's always time to go back and do iterations and get it perfect down the road. So we don't have to strive for perfection right off the bat. So at first, like doing it with a Word document for my lab manual was fine. But I knew how it could be improved. And so the next step was to go through Pressbooks and do some formatting there. But and the one other topic I want to mention is in soil science and agronomy and really agriculture in general, there are almost zero open textbooks that are available. And so for my discipline, I mean, there's lots of low-hanging fruit. And so I'm focusing on just the things that I teach. But it's different when you're in, say, like math or biology or more classes that a lot more people take, because there's actually like existing open textbooks that are on the market that you could already use and adapt. And so a lot of times the hard work's been done. It's just a matter of kind of curating it for your own students.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Andy, I see your hands.
Yeah, I wondered if you would both be comfortable in sharing a little bit in how you incorporated this into your tenure, being on the tenure track. How are these open access textbooks viewed? Are they completely separate from your research? Or, I mean, obviously, Colby, you mentioned that you had peer-reviewed articles based on completing these, but I'm just kind of wondering how these fold into your tenure file.
Yeah. Well, in my case, my appointment is majority teaching, which is different than most of the faculty in my department. So, and most agronomy faculty here are like 70% research, and so I'm one of the few that are over half teaching. And so, I guess what I sort of gathered from just talking with other faculty is that they encouraged me to become a scholar in teaching. And as long as I was still being productive on the research side, it was only sort of, now it was only a plus to have more productivity on the teaching side in terms of publications. So,
in my experience, Andy, they didn't view the OER itself as something that they valued real highly. It had to be the SOTL I produced off of it. You know what I mean? They looked at, but then also I got a lot of attention. There was a newspaper article that was like, it was kind of nationally, it was a Casey Starr writer that wrote it, but it was syndicated across a lot of other places. And so all of a sudden I could say, there's this article about my resources in like Chicago Tribune and all, the Casey Starr and all these sorts of things. And so I could point to some of those sorts of things too, to say, and then I know Colby referenced, I was part of starting the Open Alternative Textbook Initiative. And so as that was being successful, they were immune to the fact that, hey, this, he did, he start this thing, you know what I mean? And this is, something that's being very successful, and things. And so they definitely viewed that positively in that way. But I guess I was also comfortable with, I know that oftentimes people going in for tenure are kind of looking for, how do I fit this cookie cutter vision of what this looks like? I was comfortable with that. I'm going to be different, you know what I mean? And I think I can make my case, you know what I mean? With what I'm doing, that I deserve to receive the promotion and tenure in that way.
Thank you.
So Brian, I want to amplify something you just said. You kind of talked about being proactive in demonstrating your teaching excellence rather than just kind of checking boxes. And I think this is where this would fit in. I think that the thing that I will also say from my experience understanding how tenure and promotion works here at the university is that this wouldn't replace anything. So all the things that you normally have to do, this wouldn't necessarily replace any of those normal responsibilities, but this would be an addition. This would be a nice cherry on top for some of the things you might do. But I would also say that for any of you thinking about, putting lots of time into this, talk to the people in your department and see what kind of support and value they're going to give to this, especially pre-tenure, because you don't want to spend a long time doing this to the detriment of something else. And they said, we don't care about this anyway. So it's definitely kind of figure out what your department norms on this would be something I would recommend.
There were a few questions in the chat about IRB. So yeah, anytime you do a survey and you're going to publish it, it has to go through IRB. So I I did IRB requests for all of my stuff, and they were all found to be exempt. So yeah, it worked out. But let's see. And is it imperative to move your open source books to a digital format? It's a good question. I wouldn't say it's imperative. I think that my experience, students actually prefer digital. Even for a lab manual, they prefer digital. I show up to my Souls lab even where there's lots of mud and laptops and stuff, or mud and water and stuff, and there's still laptops on the benches. So students still prefer digital, it seems. And I think that if you're doing one of these projects, you get more exposure if it is digital and can be used by many other people at different campuses. So I think there's advantages to being digital.
I just want to clarify that since I asked the question. Originally, the strategy was that it would be a supplement to any class for diversity. And so it might be housed in our library as a document that the library had. But now you've got me thinking about whether it should be publishable in a digital format, because it's going to be constantly changing, and we might have a student who would help us collect those resources. So that's the reason why I'm asking about that.
Yeah, I'd echo what Colby said. And one of the benefits of the digital format is, like you said, you can make the updates and you can push them if you want to live, relatively quickly without, you can be more, Colby does a little bit more additions. I know he does some more in between updates. Like I said, I don't do additions. I'm kind of constantly revising. It's kind of my sort of approach to things. And so if a student emails me this morning, they're asking about a question that I was in mind, or if they're asking about something they don't think is clear, I'm going to possibly go back and forth to understand what they are not understanding and see if I can revise or reframe, whatever that is, to make it better. And so that's kind of what my approach is. And so you could do something similar with the resources. Sounds like you're describing too, is that if you think about it as digital, kind of first, that then it would be something that you could set up in that way to be able to take advantage of. And I've seen the same thing, even going back to my very early courses when I did this, I was somewhat an early adopter, that they definitely prefer the digital access, versus the hard copy. Even though before that, when I was asking there were some that were hesitant about, I feel like I need a hard copy to read. It just seems like they're very, it's a very low number, who are wanting a hard copy in order to be able to read their resource things now.
Well, one of the things that I'm really excited about is that Pressbooks gives you an opportunity to have a more graphic format, and that it can be incorporated back into Canvas, right, so that it's available in that format, in a digital format. And obviously the work that we're talking about doing requires update constantly. So it makes sense that it would be digital, but I hadn't thought about it. Okay. Thanks.
I'm going to jump in there and say that we are out of time. So I want to end by thanking our guests, Colby and Brian, for sharing these wonderful, arduous, and empathetic approaches to teaching our students. Thank you for being very aware of the cost at the $750 versus $1,100, whatever. That is ridiculous. And I really love what you both are doing. And also, I think there's an initiative on campus to support these efforts, if I'm not mistaken. Do either one of you want to talk about that for a couple of seconds?
Yeah, the Open Alternative Textbook Initiative is here to help support this on campus. I know that there's a big all-in sort of focus on student mental health on campus, which is great that they're going to do that this year. We were the winners last year, so we do have funding that we're looking to be able to work with people, much like, we worked with Colby we supported Colby. Colby's fantastic. Colby, did all the things he's going to do. We help provide support so Colby could be Colby, things. And so we want to help other people do the same.
Thank you, Colby and Brian.
Thank you all.
Remind you, week after spring break, we will have allyship and anti-racism with Cody Walls. Again, kind of even foreshadowing a training opportunity we have for the fall semester. Till then, I hope you have a great spring break. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you for attending.